Hello and many thanks for joining us on the program. I am Imonia Marere. Welcome. From October 31, 2021 and for the next 12 days, world leaders, activists, industrialists and young people will gather in Glasgow, Scotland for this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, otherwise known as the Conference of Parties, or simply COP26, I beg your pardon. The summit will be attended by the countries that signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a treaty that came into force in 1994. A conference of the parties is the supreme governing body of the International Convention made up of all parties and accredited observers of the treaty. COP26 was originally scheduled to hold in November 2020, but had to be postponed for 12 months because of the COVID-19 pandemic. COP26 will also be the first since the United States rejoined the Paris Agreement and making ambitious new climate commitments, such as securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping global temperatures at 1.5 degrees within reach. The latest climate change report is described as Code Red for humanity. So, what would be the ultimate goal of COP26 in this regard? Can it make credible targets and rules for achieving those targets? Do world leaders have what is required, what is needed, including political will to achieve the COP26 goals? Or is this going to be just another jamboree where leaders talk but do nothing or very little thereafter? What is a country like Nigeria taking to COP26? What are its domestic climate challenges and how well is it confronting those challenges? How loud can its voice be heard on such a global stage? What is and should be the role of environmental activists in this global struggle for a more tolerable and sustainable climate system? These are the issues we will be looking at on the program today as we do a preview of COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Summit, which is coming up in about 2 weeks. Join us right after now as we meet our guest analysts. All right, thank you so much for staying with us. With me in the studio at this point in time is a familiar face, a familiar voice as far as environmental activism is concerned. And I'm talking about Nimo Bassey. Nimo Bassey is an environmental activist, an author and poet, director head of Mother Earth Foundation, and former executive director, Environmental Rights Action. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome. Well, we also expect to join us very shortly the acting director, Department of Climate Change at the Federal Ministry of Environment, Halima Bawa Buhari. She will be joining us in a short while. Pastor Nimo Bassey, welcome once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
COP26. It has come a long way. 1 year in between the 2019 conference and this one. What would you say have been the major landmarks in the last 2 years?
Well, I think the last 2 years, what we can say, what you can count as major landmarks would be the rate at which extreme weather events have occurred in the world. much more than ever before. The amount of wildfires in Europe, in North America, in Australia, the amount of freak storms and cyclones and hurricanes have all intensified. And within this same period, the world has chalked up 1.1 degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. As you rightly mentioned at the introduction, the Paris Agreement targets at 1.5 and well below 2 degrees, something that I find very funny actually, when you say well below and compared to 1.5. I mean, it shows that really everyone knows that the temperature increase above 1 degree is something we should worry about. Because right now we have 1.5 degrees increase beyond pre-industrial levels, and we're already having these terrible weather events. What will happen if we have 1.5 degrees? What will happen if we have 2 degrees? And actually, right now, according to the United Nations, after adding up what governments have presented they would do to tackle global warming, we're actually aiming at 2.7 or above degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial level, which is totally cataclysmic.
When you say pre-industrial levels, what exactly do you mean? Please break that down a little bit so that we can understand it better. For those of us who are laymen and lay women in this area of interest.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I think it's necessary to clarify that because pre-industrial level time is a time before the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Before then, temperature increase in the world was very gradual or minimal. It wasn't anything to worry about. But since Industrial Revolution, a lot of carbon has been pumped into the atmosphere. And this is what has driven the problem that we're having currently. So that's like a benchmark. Before the Industrial Revolution, the world was warming at a more natural rate. But since then, because of the amount of greenhouse gases and carbon pumped into the atmosphere, some into the stratosphere, the world is now experiencing very extreme temperature increases.
Well, so why is the conference in Glasgow this year called COP26?
Well, you know, every year a COP is held. We've had many COPs. This will be the 26th Conference of Parties since the beginning of putting into practice the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As you also mentioned, this should have held last year in 2020, but this is 2021 because of the coronavirus. And in fact, for this one coming up in Glasgow in October, November, at the end of this month and early November, many groups from different countries and in Africa have decided to boycott the COP because of COVID vaccine appetite.
In other words, the expectation that global leaders will be at the Glasgow conference is not likely to happen.
No, they will be there. Certainly, it's going to happen. I mean, when I say those who are boycotting, not the I mean, civil society. I'm talking about the people who are who's suffering the brunt of inaction at the various COPs. The activists, they've decided they will not go because some cannot even go because their countries are classified as red nations in the vaccine scenario. And so they would need to go to Europe, go to the UK, be in quarantine for maybe 10 days or so. By that time, the COP is already over. So if they want to attend, they have to go by today. They should already be in the UK to be in quarantine before they were allowed to attend the conference. So I guess the COVID itself is sabotaging the system to a large extent.
So isn't there any other alternative to attending this conference, say virtually?
Yeah, I believe a lot of people would join virtually, especially in the popular people space. And in fact, as you said, and as happened in November in this pre-COP meetings where the negotiators met to discuss, prepare for this conference of parties meeting. It should be a combination of both virtual and physical. But this also places a lot of disadvantage on vulnerable nations who don't have the capacity, sufficient capacity to participate virtually. Negotiations require physical meetings, as the experts, the negotiators will tell you. They need to be in the same room to talk about issues. The issues you cannot just conclude after 20 minutes on the internet, and then things you can discuss over lunch, over tea. in the evenings, and all this will be lost for those who cannot go there physically.
All right, we did say that the acting director of the Department of Climate Change in the Federal Ministry of Environment, Haja Halima Bawa Buhari, will be joining us. She's right here now with us. Thank you so much, madam, for finding time to join us. We understand that you had a very tight schedule today, but we're happy that you were able to join us.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and I do apologize for being late. Federal Ministry of Works and Housing has its Habitat Day today, and I was expected to do a presentation which I had to cut short and come over here.
Well, it's all part of the climate change interactions.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
Thank
so
you.
how important is COP26 to Nigeria, first as a country, because we are in Nigeria, and then, of course, the significance of this forum to the entire entire effort at ensuring that there is a tolerable climate for humanity?
The COP and any other kind of climate conference or meeting is quite important. Yes, it is a place where we, as countries, as parties, as we call them, meet and take decisions on how to go with actions that we need to take at our various countries regarding reducing impacts of climate change, whether it's through mitigation or adaptation. However, it's not just JoJo. It's important because if you're not at the table, decisions, major decisions are going to be taken that will affect your country and your citizens. What am I saying? It will affect even the way you live. We're talking about decisions being taken on climate finance, for example. We're a country that is a fossil fuel reliant country. My salaries are paid by fossil fuel, and a lot of us have cars that we drive, and all these are dependent on fossil fuel. And they are financing that are staffed off any kind of project that has fossil fuel related, in other words, petrol, LPG, and all that and all that. They are going to take decisions that will affect even the way we eat. We're going to take decisions that are going to affect the way whether deforestation is going to get worse or is going to get better. And of course, that dovetails into whether we're having more desertification if we don't act, or if we're going to have less food productivity because the soils are exposed due to the deforestation and inaction of countries. So these decisions are going to be taken, and we're going to push, of course, for finances being provided to developing countries and climate justice. So it definitely would affect persons, economies, and the way we transit, the way we transport ourselves even, you know, from from the single ones we have, you know, we have a lot of Okadas and tricycles and all that. We're supposed to be transiting to mass transport. So decisions and talks are going to go around that, and we need to be at the table to ensure that the interests of Nigeria and Nigerians and Africa as a whole are protected according to the circumstance we have found ourselves.
Well, there's one terminology you just used now which is being thrown around for some time now. I'm not very sure that so many Nigerians understand it. Climate justice. What does it mean?
Basically, Mr. Nimo Basi is here, and basically it's about equity. The word justice there is about equity. We have a situation where, let's even take the climate finance thing for example. The developed countries are basically pointed to the rising temperatures that Mr. Basi had has given earlier because of their industrialization. But then, if you look at the emissions, most of it came from there, but the effects are being felt by developing countries like Nigeria and the rest of Africa. They promised that they would send in a certain amount, $100 billion, please correct me if I'm wrong.
$138 billion.
Okay, if you say so yourself. That they would provide to developing countries to mitigate, adapt to impacts of climate change. putting in lifestyle changes and infrastructure that will enable us to reach that emission reduction requires a lot of money. And a lot of our economies are not good enough. And the COVID has further depressed it. So we need to go and push and see how these things are going. Not that the countries are not also taking action on their own, but then whoever has put us in a situation of this increased temperature has promised that they would do something to alleviate it for us. So we need to push that agenda
And those
forward.
are the industrialized countries of
Yeah.
the world. Because before now, Mr. Bassi was talking about pre-industrial era temperatures and all of that. Now, Mr. Bassi, let's look at what would constitute the major goals of COP26. What are those things that you think will be on the table or are scheduled to be on the table for discussion, for negotiation?
Well, I think maybe you should have thrown that question to, to her. But to build on what she just said, the convention was built on the premises of justice. I mean, that was suggested. And we find this justice issue in many multilateral conversations even before the COPs began to happen. The issue is it still working? Is that justice issue being elevated in the negotiations beyond people just mentioning it? It's increasingly being mentioned by everybody, but are we acting on it? The major plank there was the common but differentiated responsibilities principle, which means we all have action, responsibility to take action to tackle global warming, but the question is those who cause the problem more should also do more to tackle the problem. This is it. That's the basic thing. So that must always be on the table when the articles of the Paris Agreement are being deliberated upon. And one of the major articles that we negotiated is about the action that we're taking, and that's also why we are so concerned. Because when you're talking about taking action to tackle global warming, there are two things. Countries like Nigeria and all the other countries have submitted their nationally determined contributions. Nigeria has submitted her own. African countries have submitted their own. But the question is, who really created the problem? And now the ground has been made so level that whether you really created the problem more than everyone else, you don't have a rigid obligation. You don't have a binding obligation to cut emissions to a certain level. So every country is proposed, they're all proposing what is convenient for them to do. And they're all setting deadline of 2050 or beyond as the day where they're going to achieve what they say they're going to achieve. And you know what that means to politicians. Politicians are in office for 4 years, 8 years, maybe 5 years or 10 years, not much more than that for most of them. And so when a politician puts a target for 2050, he's putting a target for somebody else to answer to. Somebody else to be accountable for. And if the temperature increases, go on the way they go on now, those guys will not be anywhere around. They may not be around to answer to that question. So they are passing the buck. They are avoiding action. And so, and surprisingly, even though they are passing the buck, they are not also ready to do anything. They are not ready to do, apart from making the commitments, to actually show they want to take action. As I mentioned earlier, when the United Nations looked at all the NDCs submitted by various countries, they found that it's actually adding up to more crisis for the world. And so what is it that will increase the ambition of those who have created the problems and who are still pumping carbon into the atmosphere? One of the things that will come up on the table will be the means of doing that. Apart from the financial aspect, which I think 100 billion is such a small target for industrialized nations to put on the table. The US itself suffered impacts of climate change, of weather events this year, 2021, that is worth more than $100 billion. One nation. So when you look at all the other nations, all the other vulnerable nations that are being trashed by cyclones, by hurricanes and the rest, flood, are losing land from coastal erosion, losing agriculture and everything, and the temperature increases in a way that people cannot manage. If you target to give them 100 billion, it is too small. But even as it's too small, that money is not forthcoming. This is the crisis that we're facing.
So promises are made, pledges are made, and they are not redeemed.
So far, we're not seeing them be redeemed. In fact, the monies ought to be, at Copenhagen, the money that was put on the table to 2020 was $10 billion. That was never met. 10 billion was never met.
Now we're talking about 100 billion.
For 2020, they agreed for a long time ago that from last year, this money will go up to 100 billion. And they're looking for creative ways, fictional ways of accounting, like counting loans and other things as part of that climate finance, which I believe Nigerian and African nations are opposed to that kind of calculation. People are asking for real additional funding.
Naja, let's break this down a little bit more. For all we know, Africa contributes about 1% or even less than 1% to carbon emissions globally. So why should African countries like Nigeria be concerned about the impact on climate change?
Or rather, the emission reduction efforts?
Yes.
In as much as, yes, we produce less of the emissions, but we still need to put some effort in our countries. Climate change has no boundaries, it has no borders, like the consequent impacts of it has no borders either. So if you say, oh, we're not emitting much, it's coming from somewhere, but we are the ones bearing the brunt because we do not even have the financial or infrastructural capacity, perhaps even technical, to deal with the impacts of climate change. It is our communities that are ravaged by drought and desertification and leading to lack of food, shortages of water. We have seen how the Lake Chad has shrunk. Apart from other issues of increased flooding now in places that didn't used to happen, some communities further down the coast have disappeared because the sea is rising. So we can't say, oh, we don't produce much, so we're not going to do anything. We still have to contribute our own quota towards the global effort to try and keep the temperatures down.
In other words, you are saying that perhaps occurrences, seasonal and sometimes daily occurrences, like flooding, like hurricanes, like desertification, like shrinking land spaces and all of that, are the direct impact of climate change. I need you to explain that more to the ordinary Nigerian, the ordinary viewer anywhere around the world who may not understand this. Every day we hear of one hurricane in either South America or North American country or even in the Caribbean. Many people do not relate this to climate change. Is that the case? Some interpretations that are given to some of these natural occurrences are sometimes religious. Yes, so we need to begin to explain some of this.
Okay. Yes, you have said it. The impacts of climate change are different according to geographies and localities. Here in Nigeria, of course, as you said, some places have hurricanes, some places have the ice melting and all that. In Nigeria, the classic cases, as I said, is the desertification, the increase in temperature that causes desertification and the shrinkage of water bodies, like I've said, the increasing flooding in almost everywhere in the country where we didn't even used to experience it before. And of course, the sea level rise at the coast and attendant erosion, eroding whole communities. How did we get there? The whole issue about climate change is man's activity that brings out what we call the gases, the greenhouse gases, that instead of when the sun hits the earth, the heat should go back to the outer atmosphere. These gases, because they're there in the atmosphere, holds it and makes the world warmer. And it is that warming that translates into weather events, erratic weather events and extreme weather events like the heat wave, the flooding, just that increasing in temperature, to the point that I think some of the pandemic is being thrown at endangered species or species that are supposed to be normally in the forest but are having interaction with man. Why they have interaction with man? The forests are reducing. Apart from man is cutting, it's not surviving because of the warming of the temperature. So the ecosystems, where the habitats, where these animals live, it's getting smaller and smaller. Water bodies are getting smaller. We're having increasing issues about not having enough water for man and his animals, and it's causing a lot of conflicts and all that. So yes, people can believe it's spiritual, as we're a very spiritual country, but the science says it's climate change.
Mr. Bassi, one of the key objectives of COP26 is securing global net zero by the mid-century. That's around 2050, thereabout now. And it is hoped that at COP26 or after COP26, countries of the world will be able to build what they call defenses, warning systems and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods and even lives. How feasible is this objective? Given the account of what you have talked about before.
Sure. When people talk about net zero, it's also lack of willingness to admit that we are in an existential problem. The problem you're having is so serious that net zero is fiction. But it's so popular with transnational corporations, with governments. In fact, everybody talk about net zero or carbon neutrality. The EU says they're going to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. What does it mean? It means, basically, this is what it means, that you continue pumping these greenhouse gases, the carbon into the atmosphere, but then you take other actions that offsets, that compensates for the problem you are creating. So you don't stop committing the problem. It's like in the days past, it's like, let's put these examples. Maybe one person is a sinner, so to speak, in quotes. The other one is not a sinner. So now the one that is not a sinner says, I'm going to stay I will not become a sinner. Then the sinner says, I will not stop sinning, but I'm going to pay you to stay as a non-sinner, so that when you don't sin, it compensates for my
own sins,
my wasteful living, my sin. That is the best way to understand it. So net zero means I keep on polluting. I will not change the way I live. I'll keep on burning coal, gas, and crude oil to produce energy, electricity. But then I'm going to capture the carbon and bury it somewhere, or I'm going to buy a forest and nobody will touch that forest, and the forest will absorb the carbon, the trees will absorb the carbon. Or I'm going to put mirrors or make the clouds whiter. These are geoengineering, climate engineering processes that you can either get more carbon to be captured by the ocean, or to be reflected, more radiation to be reflected by the clouds, or to be carbon to be sucked into the ocean, or you're going to capture the carbon and bury it. Recently, one country, they built a big factory whose job is just to suck carbon from the atmosphere. And it was fun. It was very expensive stuff. The carbon that factory, the first of that size, can capture is not up to, in a year, it's not up to what is produced in the world in 1 minute. And so the ideas are fantastic. They sound like they could work, but they are just that, fantastic ideas. They could give people the confidence to keep on living in the pattern they are living that is causing the problem, rather than actually doing the action. The action means stop using fossil fuels. This is a simple solution to global warming. Stop drilling for more, looking for new oil fields. Stop depending on gas. Natural gas is not, they call it the bridge fuel, but it's not. Pipelines, gas pipelines have a tendency of leaking methane, and methane is even more lethal than carbon dioxide, although it kind of degrades after about 10 years or so in the stratosphere. It goes beyond the atmosphere. And so the problem we're facing right now is getting nations and corporations. Corporations, some polluting companies are spending a lot of money advertising on Facebook, advertise social media, advertise generally to convince politicians not to take action about shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources.
Can the world really afford to stop using fossil fuel? And if it does, how soon can that be? We'll talk about that when we return from the break. All right, thank you so much for staying with us. People, politics, and power. And we're looking at COP26, which comes up in another 2 weeks in Glasgow, in Scotland. Haja, the latest climate change report describes the current condition as code red for humanity. Now, why is this so, and what does that mean?
It's just telling us that the way we're living and the way we're using the earth is not sustainable. And we need to do something, and we need to do something now. As I said earlier when I started the talk, we're supposed to make efforts that would keep temperatures well below 2 degrees, preferably at 1.5 degrees temperature rises. Currently, I believe we're at 1.2 or so, and this is 2021, and the way things are going, the science tells us that we're likely going to get to 2 point something. So that's why it's code red. That means that we need to take action now. In fact, like yesterday, like Mr. Bassi was saying, we need to take as much action towards reducing at least the emissions that are being produced, the carbon emissions, methane, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Take actions that would also expand the space that for carbon sinks, whether it's the forests, whether it's the oceans, or the wetlands, all other natural bodies that can help us to suck in the carbon. So we need to take action. We need to take action.
And one of those actions is reduce the use of fossil fuel. Yes. Knowing that many countries of the world today still depend largely on fossil fuel, how feasible is that? How realizable is that? And in what time frame?
Okay. Mr. Bassi and I are on different spheres on this. We are in an economy that uses fossil fuels, so it's a reality for us. It's about, when I first started speaking, it's about national circumstances and being realistic. You still have a population that is dependent on fossil fuel, and an economy that is still undergoing the processes of diversification. Yes, we will take action as best as possible. Timelines we've said in our NDCs up to 2030, and we have, of course, started taking the actions that are possible, whether it's by government, individuals, or companies, or whichever can help push the process for us. So we're looking towards 2030. By 2030, we've done something as much as we can to reduce our own quota, which we pledged in 2015, that we will try and reduce by 20%. Each country in its NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, gave a commitment, and we gave a commitment. President Buhari gave a commitment of 20%. We'll do efforts on our own to reduce greenhouse gases. With help of the international community, 45%. And with the revised NDC, like Mr. Bassi had said earlier, which was submitted in July, we have increased the one that comes with support to 47%. So there are quotas by every country.
By 2030.
By 2030.
But we have not been able to meet the 2020 target of 20%, did we?
We have a target up to 2030. Increasingly from 2015, every 5 years we're supposed to increase ambition up until 2030. So we're still in the process of increasing ambition, increasing efforts towards reducing and mitigating and adapting to climate change by 2030.
With gas flaring still very prominent in our energy sector, how really cogent can that be? I mean, how do we actually expect to meet those targets?
We will do our best as the Ministry of Environment, but as you know, the gas issues are in another ministry, but we are talking, and I'm sure we'll take the necessary steps that need to be taken.
Mm. All right. Well, one of the things that COP26 is hoping to look at is setting credible rules, is it rules they call them now? Yes, credible rules for global carbon trading. What is carbon trading in the first instance?
Well, permit me to talk about the gas flaring aspect before I go to that. Because I think there's been element of carbon. In some years back, some people were applying for clean development mechanism credits, which is part of carbon trading, that they're going to use the gas to produce electricity. Therefore, and now the idea of the carbon develop green, the CDM, the clean development mechanism, was for, has been wrongly interpreted. I mean, I believe the intention was not if you stop an action that was already illegal. But if you stop an action because you see that it could be problematic, then you stop it. Gas flaring has been illegal in Nigeria since 1984, when the present president was head of state. And so the need to stop gas flaring has been recognized by Nigeria. But each year they keep shifting the deadline, shifted to 2020, shifted to 2025, and now it's 2030. And so we really need to see real determination by that government wants to stop this. We saw the Petroleum Industry Act. It has no indication that gas is going to stop gas flaring. Rather than stopping gas flaring, it's all about gas infrastructure. One could say that the gas infrastructure will stop gas flaring, but a lot of the gas that Nigeria is exporting today or using today are from gas fields. We're talking about flaring of associated gas, the gas that comes out of the wells when oil is extracted. That is the one we don't want to see anymore. This one that was declared illegal since 1984, but it's an abridgment. It's against the constitutional right of Nigerians to the right to life. It's against our right to safe environment. It's against every right. And so there's really no reason to continue flaring gas, which is also contributes to global warming. But again, as has been said, it's also a political question whether those who have not created the problem should do anything at all, towards stopping global warming. And the idea that everybody's okay, this is a problem that affects all human beings, we'll do what we have to do. What we can do, there's some countries who don't have any emission to cut. I mean, if you want to calculate in terms of percentages, it would be even up to 0 point anything. But they still have to make prediction that they're going to make a pledge that they will cut emissions as a way of showing goodwill. Then those who are really creating the problems are still looking for ways to evade action. Carbon trading is equivalent to, is just what is driving the net zero argument. It's part of it. It's called, I would characterize this as carbon or market environmentalism. You think that the market can solve the problem. So those who pollute, have excess carbon, now buy the right from those who are not polluting. It's buying that right. You're buying the right to pollute. That's carbon trading. That somebody's going to buy the right to pollute, to compensate for the carbon that you are releasing. And those who release a lot of carbon pay those who don't release a lot of carbon, and they make money. And this calculation is mostly true between factories, between corporations. So corporations who don't pollute as much make more money, while those who pollute keep on polluting. It's a way of just locking in the problem, not solving the problem. Making people it's like pretending that money can solve this problem. Money can aid you to tackle the problem, like building resilience, taking mitigation actions. But the actual thing of stopping carbon is not about money. It's about politically deciding that, look, this thing is killing us, destroying the world, and we must stop it. And so carbon trading is about making money. Some people call it carbon colonialism. Because, for example, I'll give you one example about carbon trading in terms of carbon capture by trees, seeing trees as carbon sinks. There was a time in Mozambique where some villagers were paid less than $100. I was counting millions and billions. Less than $100 to watch over tracts of a forest or some trees for 99 years. And the thing was that the agreement was that even if those who signed the agreement and collected the $100 died, their children and children's children will keep watching those trees to maintain the carbon industries. That's carbon slavery, carbon colonialism. That is being cancelled because people talked about campaign against it, and so it was cancelled. So this is the worst example of carbon trading, or pretending that you can make money by sinking carbon in trees or by some other means.
So, Aja, let's talk about what Nigeria is taking to COP26. Is Nigeria prepared for negotiations, and what are those things that you will be putting, Nigeria as a country will put you on the table? What are those things you hope to bring back home as concrete achievements from COP26?
Yes, Nigeria is ready. Yes, we are ready for the negotiations, and we have put the negotiators ready, and basically the agenda items for COP26, because is the interest of the COP26 presidency's adaptation. So we are looking towards making more movement there. Mr. Bassi was talking about the carbon trading, which now is being discussed under what we call the Article 6. And that particular article was one of the agenda items that made the last COP25 not conclusive, as you yourself said earlier, because there are still contentious issues for African countries. We are going to pursue that and ensure that whatever decisions are taken on issues of market mechanisms for carbon is advantageous to Nigeria. We're going to negotiate also on what we call the loss and damage. And this is where the issues of disasters come on. What do we do about them? How do we do about this? Something we call the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. We're trying to ensure that that is established to take care of issues that come from climate change disasters. So we're going to pursue that. The COP25 had already dealt and kind of, not concluded, but made a lot of progress on the issues of gender and climate change. And nationally, we've been able to domesticate that from COP25. We have a gender action plan, climate change, which we hope to pursue. And of course, like in all other things, yes, there are some things we can do on our own, but there need to be to have some kind of assistance and support to translate these actions nationally or domestically for our people. And of course, yes, the means of implementation, as we call it, which also includes the finance, technology transfer, and all other modalities and strategies that we need to do. So we're going to go out there and look at what we can get for our countries through the negotiations and the side events and the basic bilateral and multilateral meetings that will be on the sidelines of COP26.
Last week, Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo was at one of the pre-COP26 conferences in the UK. And there he spoke about the limiting of development of gas projects. Limiting of development of gas projects, which he said poses dire challenges to Nigeria. Now, what he was talking about here is the defunding of gas projects by the international community. I think that is one of the things that is on the table right now, the funding of gas projects in the run-up to the global net zero emission goal of meeting that target and all of that. What does this particularly mean, or what do you understand by it?
Well, the Vice President also wrote an article recently in Foreign Policy magazine in the US, where he said that it's unfair to ask African countries to stop expanding the reach for the use of fossil fuels because other regions use that to develop. I mean, that kind of argument is, in a certain sense, is valid. But when we look at the crisis before us today, we should not really be making the argument. Sometimes, you just sit down and say, but we didn't create this problem. These people, the rich countries, they use coal to build their factories for industrialization. But they did not only use fossil fuel, they also used slavery and colonialism. So you have to, if you want to be like them, you have to also add those things that they did that really gave them. They more or less grabbed the resources of the global south and used it to develop themselves. So it wasn't just the energy source. So picking only one item to try to replicate what they did is not going to work, except you can reconstruct the objective, the objective and material objective of that time, which is clearly or more or less impossible today. You're not going to slave anybody. You're not going to colonize, although colonialism has not ended. And this is one of the things we're fighting even through this conference of parties in terms of negotiations. Because although it's one country, one vote, when they're negotiating, you find that some countries would have maybe 5 negotiators, 2 people, delegation, while others have 200 delegates or add more. Having young people, old people, technocrats, all there. And so the equation is never balanced because of the different differing conditions. And so the Vice President's argument, while sounding strong, I think needs to be moderated in the sense of that we're facing a crisis in the world today, and we cannot go through the same route. The fact that these people went through that to develop, and somebody said this, I need to repeat it, I think I've said it on this program before, a former minister of Saudi Arabia, he said that the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. And the fossil fuel age will not end for lack of fossil fuels. The petroleum age, which we are in now, would not end because there is no petroleum. People are still finding new oil fields. Like right now in Okavango, Namibia and Botswana, one of the biggest oil fields on the continent just been discovered. But the people living there say that, look, you're going to kill us if you develop this. It's going to pollute our rivers. You're going to destroy our culture, destroy everything. We have to get to a point where we realize that really preserving biodiversity is one way of fighting global warming. And depending on fossil fuels is one way of damaging biodiversity. So you see that it's not in our best interest. We move from, the world is going to move from depending on national grid. All these electric wires running, just like we'll move away from using telephone wires to a mobile phone. The world is going to move to renewable energy, which you can supply a village, autonomous energy system, a city, a region, without having to depend on national grids that run all over the place. And so we need to think differently than say we must use this medium. Renewable energy will create more jobs and build our economy better than petroleum industry. The petroleum sector invests less than 10%, maybe 5% in the Nigerian economy. The infrastructure, the oil rigs and all the things, the floating platforms, they're all fabricated abroad. Workers abroad, they bring them here to install in Nigerian waters, to drill the oil. So the economy doesn't really feel the impact of the sector. But if we invest now in renewable energy, you can develop the technology, train our people, you're going to have a lot more integrated influence on the economy, which is more beneficial. So we win on every side. But petroleum sector puts money into the bank, and then governors come to Abuja to share the money. So what's that?
Aja, there is also the talk about climate smart industrialization. What does that mean? Is there any connection to this, to what Basi just explained? The whole concept of renewable energy and abandonment of fossil fuel.
Yes, basically it is climate smart anything is ensuring that you kind of put that climate credential in the processes of the production you have. Instead of using fossil fuel to power or some of your machines, you use the renewable energy sources that are available and look at technologies that are more climate friendly. So yes, there are climate smart industrial processes. There's also climate smart agriculture. Climate smart ways of doing things basically is about trying to reduce the
greenhouse
gases,
the carbon emissions.
Yes, also adopting renewable energy depending on what kind is immediately available to you. To us, it's the solar. And also adaptation. And adaptation, as he had earlier said, it's about conserving biodiversity, which includes both the vegetation and the animals and the wetlands and the water systems around us. So it's both. It's a balance of both. He says net zero is some corporate thing, but to me, net zero is about balancing. While you're reducing, you're increasing the sinks and reducing emission sources.
S0 is climate arithmetics. Arithmetic will not solve the problem. We need to take real action.
Yeah, so, well, Basi, finally, COP26 is coming at a time, about 50 years after Stockholm.
Yeah, Stockholm Declaration was made 50 years ago. And so it coincides with this COP.
With this COP.
And that declaration really laid the foundation for environmental laws, means of engagement and all that. But it was quite prophetic 50 years ago. In many ways, concerning also the way the world is responding to environmental problems today. It also saw why problems would arise if you use technology in a negative way. But well, I'm preempting your question. I don't know what question you have in mind, but let me say this.
Go ahead.
The problem with that document, I mean, first of all, we have to recognize that it's 50 years old. It was done with a typewriter, not with a computer. It's 50 years old. And it made some statements that are very positive. For example, going against colonialism, going against apartheid, and that this must not be allowed in the world. But it also blamed the victims. It said that many of the environmental problems in poor countries caused by their poverty. I mean, that's totally crazy, totally unacceptable, because it doesn't allow us to look at what is creating the problem. What is causing the environmental degradation we have today is not poverty. Our environment provides the wealth, the richness of our people. Our people are basically rich if you allow them to live with the environment. But when you go there to pollute, to destroy, and to extract without putting anything back, then you are actually building poverty and killing the people. And so you cannot blame the people. In fact, the document was produced from a northern perspective, the global north perspective, that didn't fully understand the global south. So they didn't mention indigenous rights, for example, not even once. But you see, peoples are mentioned there, which really was was also progressive. It was limited by the understanding of the complex nature of the environment in the world today. And it was around that time too. I mean, in that same sequence, it was moving when the world prepared the Rome Statute, for example, having laws like war crimes, having crimes against genocide, crimes against humanity. The crimes against the environment were also excluded because of the powerful forces responsible for making these laws. Because the powerful forces influencing the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement also, that is making it almost impossible to reach solution that would benefit the poor people in this world.
Well, they say, Aja, they say that the whole challenge of climate change is a collective effort that must push this. What would then be your message to ordinary Nigerians? Agreed, I mean, as a country, we are responsible for very little of the climate crisis. But then, in our own smaller environments, what is it that as individuals we can do? And as an environmentalist, what is it that we can do to help the situation?
Climate action is for everybody. It's not just for government, for which I represent. It's for everybody. It's individual too. Changing the way we do things. Instead of taking a car, like those who can afford to, will take mass transit, buses, trains, perhaps. Instead of, conserve a lot of the natural resources that we have. Plant more, plant more, plant more. Because for us in Africa, that's the easiest and cheapest way to keep up a carbon sink. Plant more, not necessarily because you want to access any CDM or market mechanism carbon trading, but that it will help you to reduce the temperatures, whether it's within your locality or globally. It will help you keep your soil's productivity up. It will help you reduce deforestation that will cause some erosion, gully, as the case may be, or sheet in the further upper country. And it will help the water cycle. You will have more productive rains and you will have the water bodies more nourished because the water cycle is okay and you have more fish, more food perhaps available to you, and at least you're less hot and your houses are can also habitable. You can also make houses that are climate smart.
All right,
as the
thank
case
you
may
so
be.
much. Thank you. Haja Halima Bawa Buhari is the Acting Director, Department of Climate Change in the Federal Ministry of Environment. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for
And
inviting us.
Nemo Basi, environmentalist, an author, poet, is the Director, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, former Executive Director, Environmental Rights Action. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
All
for
right, and for you,
inviting
the
us.
viewer out there, thank you so much for investing your time with us. We hope that you have learned one or two things about climate change and the efforts being made by global authorities to tackle this challenge. My name is Imoni Amarere. Bye for now.